to walk. I was born in Chennai, an overcrowded coastal city in the south of India with a massive population of 7 million people. 3 months after I was born, my journey began. And since then, I've lived in 6 countries. I also fly 3 times a year to Thailand to meet my grandma who lives there. And somehow, through it all, I've developed an on-again, off-again American accent. But I still say football, not soccer. Now, taking all that into consideration, what do you think my culture is? Do I adhere to an Indian culture? Because by race, I am Indian. Emirati, because I currently live here? Or how about Indonesian? Because I spent my earliest memories of learning to walk and talk there. Or maybe Malaysian, because I spent the majority of my developmental years in the capital city of Kuala Lumpur. Most of my fondest memories come from there. I spent my awkward, prepubescent middle school years there, so it's been with me through the rough times. If there's any place that feels most like home, it's Malaysia. However, since I've left the country, I technically have nothing that associates me with it, other than these strong feelings and fond memories. Or am I part Moroccan? Because even though I've never been there, my best friend is Moroccan. And nothing feels more like home than Herrera, a delicious Moroccan soup, set down on the dinner table and made hot from his mother's tireless cooking. It's a hard question to answer, as culture is a lot more complicated to pin down than an idea like nationality. When you think about culture, you automatically think about a group of people who all share the same traditions and values. Why is that? Well, it's because the most commonly used theory to explain culture is the idea of communal culture. The word communal itself means to be shared by all members of society. This is similar to what communal culture stands for. Communal culture is a sense of belonging due to shared thought processes of a certain group. And since you can't visualize the thought processes of an entire society, they manifest into traditions followed by the specific group. But the issue with communal culture is that it defines culture to be entirely distinct between 2 different groups of cultures. Therefore, it makes an individual feel as though they can only relate to one particular cultural background, and therefore disregards people who feel as though they belong to multiple cultural backgrounds. I believe that culture is not so impermeable. Although cultural barriers existed largely in the past, now with globalization and the ability for people to travel across the world, people are exposed to a lot of different cultures. Today, we live in a world where you can be anywhere globally and still have the opportunity to experience different cultures. Globalization, the process by which businesses grow to an international scale, has made it possible for you to do this. Because of globalization, you can walk into your neighborhood mall and eat sushi. And in the process of eating foreign food, you experience foreign cultures, like by learning to use the chopsticks. In this modern age, it needs to be recognized that culture has grown past just being about your geographical origins. People are exposed to a lot of different cultures. People can be exposed to cultures different from what their parents might have inherited, and it's not uncommon for people to have parents from varying cultures. Because of globalization, being an expatriate is now a lot more common, and this facilitates for more multicultural exposure. Therefore, individuals have a lot more choice when picking what make up their personal culture. The theory of creating one's own personal culture is the idea of internalized culture, or internalization. Internalization starts with an individual's acceptance towards a set of norms. So the process of internalization starts with learning what the norms are. And then the individual goes through a process of understanding why these norms are of value to him or her, until finally they either accept or reject the norm based on their own perspectives. Internalization gives each and every individual the opportunity to pick what they want to perceive as a norm for themselves. Last year, my friend and I had the chance to partake in a senior fine arts conference in New Delhi, India. So, there we were in India, me, a hardly Indian, and my Irish friend, who had never traveled to this side of the world. We stayed at the house of an expat American teacher who had been teaching in international schools her whole life. We were both so fascinated by our room. It had an exposed Indian stone wall on one side and paintings and trinkets from around the world spread across the other. When we were sharing stories at the dinner table one night, she brought up the topic of how different cultures have impacted her and her family. She told us stories about how her oldest son grew up in India and still holds a lot of its culture with him to this day as he attends university in a small town in America. In Indian culture, utensils are not primarily used to eat. Instead, hands perform the task. So while growing up in India, her son used his hands to eat Indian breads like roti and naan. Years later, even though he was back in the US, he still couldn't let go of that Indian tradition and continues to use his hands to eat everything. He even uses his hands to eat what I guess he interprets as the American version of naan: pancakes. Which is an interesting choice taking into consideration all the sticky maple syrup and the melting butter. However, I find this to be the perfect example of internalized culture. Her son took the norms around him and created a culture for himself that combines both his love for American pancakes and his adopted Indian traditions. This is what I believe culture to be. Culture builds onto a person as they're exposed to the different ways of life. I believe that culture grows as you do, giving it the opportunity to change as your identity is enriched through new experiences. It is created and changed by every individual to suit their own lifestyle. Therefore, culture cannot be concrete. So, to get back to my question, what is my culture? Well, I still think it's a hard question to answer. However, the idea of cultural ambiguity helps make the explanation relatively simple. Someone is culturally ambiguous if he or she has been exposed to many different cultures and finds a hard time pinpointing their culture to one particular territory. For me, a term like this creates a label to associate with, rather than identifying with just Indian culture or listing a bunch of different countries. With labels, people can find a sense of security. Even if all the people brought up in a culturally ambiguous environment might not have the same mix of cultures, they can all connect and relate, knowing that other people have grown up in the same unorthodox way. It is not possible for all of us to follow exactly what is expected of one singular culture, as we've evolved to a point of existence where each of us have our own personal taste and opinions when it comes to accepting different cultures. So, even though people have always had these differences to a certain degree, globalization has made it a lot more prominent now. As the world grows to become more and more accepting and inclusive of each other, cultural ambiguity will become less of a foreign concept. Embracing cultures, and not only learning to live amongst it, but also adapting to it, will become the new norm for society as a whole. Thank you.